In the past, I've made some videos discussing vehicles from the game World of Tanks and talking about whether or not they are fake. Although there are plenty more vehicles in that game we will continue to cover in future videos, I felt it was only fair that we look at other games as well. For today, we will be talking about the fake or misleading vehicles from the game War Thunder. Overall, it's fair to say that Gaijin, the game's developer, is less guilty of delving into fantasy than their wargaming counterparts, but that's not to say they haven't done it in the past. To organize this video, I've decided it would be best to create a list of all the fake and paper designs in the game. We'll be starting with the least realistic tanks and ending with designs that may be real but are not necessarily an accurate representation of the real project. To start this list off, we have to talk about the Panther II. Although this vehicle has since been hidden from the main tree, it remained for years as a German medium tank. Many will no doubt try to argue that the Panther II is actually a real vehicle, which is true, but the one in-game is completely inaccurate. The hull is pretty much the only part of this tank that isn't entirely fantasy, with the Schmalterm turret and 88mm gun never being intended for the Panther II. As we discussed in my video about the Panther II, these components have been incorrectly added to the tank due primarily to one author's mistake with some original documents. For the full story, you can watch my video on that topic, but what that means for the tank in-game is that it is not what the true Panther II would look like. Most likely, the Panther II would have looked more like the Panther F with a slightly different turret like this one shown in World of Tanks. The night vision system it has in-game is also a bit on the fake side, although an argument can be made that later Panthers did get them, so the Panther II in theory would have received them as well. Regardless, I think we can comfortably label Gaijin's interpretation of the Panther II as a fake. Next up, we move on to another of the hidden vehicles, known as the Tiger II 10.5cm. Much like the Panther II, this tank is based on some real-world designs and proposals, but what we have in-game is more fantasy than fact. Also, like the Panther II, most of the issues with it are found in the turret. For one thing, the proposal to use a 105mm gun was never pursued, with the gun never being accepted. When you factor in the need for an additional loader as well as a larger breach into a mostly unmodified turret, we can start to see why this never got off the ground. This is before we even mention the added rangefinder, which further takes up precious space in the vehicle. In fact, if you look closely, the breach already slightly clips into the rangefinder before you even depress the gun, so how this tank manages 8 degrees of gun depression is anyone's guess. Last but not least, this tank features a massive increase in horsepower to 900 horsepower from the original 700 horsepower of the Tiger II. Without the game specifying which engine the tank uses, it is hard to say for certain, but most likely it would be an upgraded form of the Maybach HL230, which the Tiger II already used, called the HL234, featuring fuel injection to supposedly reach 900 horsepower. Keep in mind that according to an interview with Kneipkamp after the war, this was done without the air filter or an exhaust muffler, so the final power rating was agreed to be 850 horsepower. As with the Panther II, Gaijin's Tiger II 105 is essentially a work of fiction. I will actually be returning to this topic in the near future because there's a lot more to it than we can discuss in this video, so make sure you're subscribed for that. The next, and likely most controversial on my list, is the Ostvin II. Added as a replacement to the Flak Panzer 341, more commonly known as the Coelian, this anti-air vehicle is just the Ostvin but with an additional 37mm mounted alongside the original. The controversial part of this comes when you dig into the history surrounding this machine. There is some mention of a single example being made at Ostbau, but despite quite a bit of digging, I have not been able to turn up any additional information regarding this prototype. Even if this is true and the vehicle was built, the one shown in War Thunder is inaccurate, as it is said that the only modification made to the original Ostvin turret was to enlarge the front opening to allow both gun barrels to fit. What we see instead are 2 separate slots cut into the turret with one for each gun. Considering Gaijin used the same source material I'm using right now for some changes made to the Kugelblitz, I know they must have seen this, so the choice to portray it differently is strange. I will admit this particular example is a bit more of my own opinion regarding the vehicle, but I feel that without more information I cannot confidently say whether or not this design was real, so until we can learn more about this vehicle, I feel it is arguably a fake tank. The vehicle it replaced, ironically, has more documentation, with several photos showing a mock-up turret on the Panther hull, although in fairness, none were actually produced. Following that on my list is Gaijin's portrayal of the E-100. Although the E-100 was indeed a real project, which we have already covered on this channel, the one in War Thunder is highly inaccurate. As with the other tanks we've discussed, this primarily is because of the turret it's equipped with. In reality, no turret was ever selected for the E-100, and even though the mouse turret it's equipped with would technically have been available, it would not have worked as it was too heavy. Although some of the original drawings do seem to indicate a mouse-style turret, these were really just placeholders, with the most likely candidate for the turret if the tank was finished being a lightened version of the Mouse 2 term. The armor thicknesses may not be accurate, but the turret shown on World of Tanks E-100 is much closer to what would likely have been used by the tank. So although it may seem on the surface to be a logical combination, the tank in game is actually made less realistic by being portrayed with the turret from the mouse. Next up is one that's a little more on the fence as to whether it can be considered a fake tank or not. The Tiger II SLA-16 is the only tank outside of the Ostvin II so far to still be available for purchase in-game. Despite this, however, there exists little evidence that any of these vehicles were ever built. The proposal to use this engine was indeed real, and there seems to have been some testing done with experimental engines, including in the chassis of a King Tiger. However, this engine was a project between Porsche and Simmering, and with the most likely available test hull being one of the Jagdtigers with Porsche's suspension, it seems unlikely that a normal King Tiger hull would have been diverted for this test. So although there is some basis in reality, the Tiger II SLA-16 as shown in game is more along the lines of a what-if tank than a true portrayal of that project historically, at least from the information I could find. I'll leave it to you guys in the comments to discuss why the only tanks on this list so far have been German, but we do have a few more tanks to cover. You can argue that some or all of the tanks I already talked about were paper designs, but the remaining tanks are undeniably riding that line, with some teetering more to one side or the other. Probably the best examples of this are the HoRe Prototype and HoRe Production. I mentioned this briefly in my video about the Chi-Re, that there were indeed some designs drafted up of a tank destroyer built on the Chi-Re chassis. However, as these were never built in any form that we know of, it's odd to label one as a prototype and the other as a production version. Both seem to be based on the wooden mock-up of one of the potential layouts, with the rest of the design's aspects being estimated or made up entirely. We see a similar situation with the Italian Sidom 25 Mistral, which was a proposed upgrade package, but seemingly was never actually built outside of mock-ups. The only photo of this vehicle not taken from Arma shows only one launcher compared to the two it features in-game. Some of these were reportedly ordered, but it seems that none were ever produced. Although this definitely isn't an outright fake tank, I thought it was worth mentioning in the context of this video, considering the questionable nature of its existence. The last tank on my list might surprise you, since the T-28 has become a well-known tank in recent years. Although it is technically a real vehicle, this two-track version of the T-95 is not a separate tank. If you haven't watched my full video on the T-95, I recommend you do so, since it can explain a lot of the misconceptions about this vehicle's designation, but I'll give a short version for you here. Essentially, during the development of the T-95, the designation was changed several times, with it being referred to as the T-28 or T-95 depending on when you look at the project. Although you can see real footage of the tank with the outer tracks removed, this does not change the vehicle's designation, and this was only really intended for transporting the vehicle. In theory, you could likely operate the vehicle in this way in combat, but the increased strain on the suspension would almost certainly result in issues for the tank. Like the Mistral, this tank is not quite fake, but I would argue the way it is shown in game is unrealistic, bordering on pure fiction. Although perhaps in the future we can come back and do a full video considering the historical accuracy of War Thunder as a whole that gets a bit outside of the scope of this particular video. As I've mentioned in the past, I personally have nothing wrong with fictional tanks being added to games, especially if they are properly labeled as such. Unfortunately, many of the examples we've looked at today, particularly the German ones, have almost undoubtedly contributed to the immense amount of misinformation surrounding German tank designs, especially in the mid to late war period. To their credit, many of these have been mostly hidden from the game now, but clearing the record about exactly what was wrong with their portrayal still felt important enough to me to warrant a video. Overall, most of these tanks aren't entirely fake, but the way they are portrayed in the game is more fiction than reality. If you think I missed any questionable or outright fake tanks, let me know in the comments and maybe I can cover that in a part 2 to this video. I'm sure the comments on this particular video will get quite spicy, as in my experience, War Thunder players don't like any mention of the inaccuracies in their game. Thanks as always to my channel members who support the content, and to all of you who come back every week for my new uploads. I'll see you here next Friday for another installment of Fake Tank Friday.